Okay. All right, folks. Welcome to this new discussion. This time about clean architecture, which is part of the events we do for the community, for the sake of and for our selfish purposes of learning more from your ideas, of course. And we are here with the largest and most thriving community of people who care about the code they write and want to make the other colleagues a good life, wants to grow, wants to basically people who care about refactoring, testing, and architecture. Hello, Peter. Hello, Peter.
Hey.
And I brought 3 friends. I brought 3 friends this time because you are probably bored of listening to me, so I got some friends with me today to argue with. We have Ralph and Peter from last time. And also Angel wanted to join today, so he's welcome. Please welcome the guys. And the plan today is to talk about concentric architecture, the stuff that we didn't got to go in last time. I tried. We tried, but we never get that far. There was a lot of stuff to discuss about boundaries last time. So today we're going to follow up. We're going to continue from where we left off. The main idea, the main points that I want to put on the screen today is going to be dependency inversion. We're going to talk about hexagonal, onion, the clean architecture rules. There are going to be basically 3 slides here. And then we're going to start debating and arguing about pros and cons and what's the next step further as we go on. So you can find more details about my guests here in the community page. And besides that, let's get started. So my plan is to keep my discussion as brief as possible. So I'm going to just throw out some code to you and explain a bit some stuff about what dependency inversion is, why do we care about that, and then kill you with 3 diagrams and then unleash the debate. Okay, that's the plan. So we have a domain, so help us God. Let's make it bigger a bit. We have a domain which should be kept clean and which should contain the implementation of our essential business logic, of our core fundamental things that we want to achieve good in life with our project. Inside this domain, we have a domain service, which in my case is called notification service, which contains some business logic. You can imagine here whatever you want, but the point is that somewhere along the line, I want to retrieve some user from an external system. And please notice how beautiful API I engineered myself. Fetch user takes a user ID and returns a user, which is a record with 3 fields. Very simple structures, very friendly structures, immutable all the way, everything cool. Now, this fetch user is not a real thing. It's just an interface. It's just an interface which is kept in my domain and which is implemented outside of my domain in a bad zombie land known as infrastructure, which is the place in which the interface is implemented by talking to some very old, ugly API called LDAP. Null, uppercase, F name. Who the hell calls it F name, right? You will see here objects that have tremendous fields. You will see here objects generated by Swagger that you cannot possibly touch.
You can't touch this.
Right? So technically, this is garbage, right? And there will be hacks. There will be UN, and this is not United Nations. And out of all this garbage comes out user. My own structure, made by my liking, which is part of my domain model, which is a value object with 3 fields and a bit of behavior inside, very cleanly helping the rest of my business logic to simplify it as much as possible. So the fundamental idea here that I want you to notice, it's about the lines. Please notice the domain here, containing an interface, this, which is implemented from outside from the zombie land, so that my domain, my green area, doesn't have to know of the red thing. No, only the red thing has to know about, what did I do? Only the red thing has to know about the green thing. This is sometimes referred to as dependency inversion. Because my domain knows nothing about what's underneath. My domain knows about the interface, which shields the core of my logic against the garbage outside. Dependency inversion. Arguably one of the most important rules in architecture, dependency inversion, which is the D in solid principles. Okay, dependency inversion. It's kind of the idea. Now, this is one point I wanted to make. Yeah, encapsulation, hiding out, decluttering my core. Okay. Now the slides I wanted to bring on. Architecture. Just a second. Scrolling. Scrolling through architecture. And there. First application of this principle, 2005, Alistair Cockburn. The article is there, and it's here. I'm going to paste the slides in the community. Very old stuff, but the idea is like this. We have in the core of our first, let's put it in the context. 2005, right? The year of GUI, the year of Suki Lee. The year of there were barely any dependency injection frameworks back then. Barely. There were some, but yeah, still starting. This is the application. The application contains entities, which are classes storing the persistent data of my application. Use cases containing behavior, my features. Input ports, gates through which WebSockets, REST APIs, back in the days, SOAP endpoints, through which we're calling the use case. And use case, if it wants to go out, it will use output port, which is the interface that my application defines, and the other class in the Zombieland implements. Just like I showed you just now, the class implementing the interface. So what's here? Please notice persistent database here, with a smell of SQL exception and a smell of result set, like we did in the old days. The younger of you did not never meet probably Suki Lee exception, but it was a mess of the code that we wanted to keep out, and we've hidden through behind a nice interface defined in my terms, in my world. Hexagonal architecture. Quick note: these interfaces at the beginning they are actually a mistake. Alistair didn't meant to put them there. They are not files. They are just supposed to represent the public methods that the endpoints can call to get into the logic of the application. They are not literally classes. And the flow control goes from left to right. This message queue listeners, REST API, SOAP, anything goes in, and I can go out through this interface, through this dependency inversion that we've introduced a moment ago. Okay. Now nowadays ORM plays the role of the persistence adapter. Now the calls go this way, and this is your hexagonal architecture. Right. What happens next? What happened next in history? Domain-driven design happened. Domain-driven design, actually that's in the extra slide, which brought some ideas to the discussion that we want to focus on the core problem, we want to collaborate with experts, we want to establish a ubiquitous language, and technically we want to center our problem around the domain of our complexity. Then please welcome Onion. This slide, one more, and we're done. And I'm gonna shut up. So, Onion architecture goes like this. You can recognize here the persistence thing that we've seen previously in the previous slide. We can recognize the adapters that we can use to call outside some APIs or very dark libraries, right? You can recognize the application. You have to have a bit of imagination to see the resemblance, especially because the flow control goes from top to down here. But I wanted to keep with the standard image. And inside the application, we have a domain model, which contains the structures and the logic classes that we want to write. In addition, back in 2008, we had presentation. For those of you nostalgic, I'm talking about GSP, GSF, Vaadin, and all the other beautiful frameworks to generate frontend on the server side. Good. The point was separate presentation from application. Some people would call this model view controller. Separate application from infrastructure, Please welcome again dependency inversion here, interface up, implemented down. And there is one more line. So the dependencies always go inwards in any concentric architecture, right? The code dependencies go this way, right? There is one more line that is new to the game here. Probably under the influence of domain-driven design, Jeffrey Palermo added the separation between the domain and the application, which is very interesting. Which tries to say, keep the stuff that has to do with your core rules in one place and keep the use cases on the other side. Don't promote anything to the domain. You need to, we're gonna debate this. Also, please notice the line between here, which means that an application, if you want to go to some API, needs to do this kung fu with interface and adapter implemented backwards. 2008, ORM were just starting. So persistence is still here modeled as a dependency inversion here, but if you do have some ORM, that will play the role of your persistence layer, if you want. That's kind of the onion architecture. Last slide, and then we can, last slide I want to bring up. 2012, Uncle Bob wrote the most influential article about software architecture today in modern history. There is no group that I meet in which there is no one who saw this picture before. There is always someone in any group that I have that knows about this. Now, 10 years ago, more than 10 years ago, Uncle Bob wanted to write this article extremely generic. And like any very generic thing, it's wrong. It's overly generic, and it wants to be applicable to any kind of application you will ever write. And like any super generic rule, it cannot be very helpful in practice. But still, the rules are very, very cool. The first rule: don't keep your core application independent of the way you present your information. It's super interesting still for mobile applications, for desktop applications, or for building reports. But in modern architecture, the front end moved to a single page app, a separate team. But anyway, don't pollute your core logic with stuff having to do with UI. Don't pollute your core logic with stuff having to do with database. Database is a detail, says Uncle Bob. Don't couple yourself to some weird PLSQL in the database. Don't write SQL. These are ugly. You don't want to pollute your code with them. Don't bind yourself to external foreign APIs without defending against them with adapters like the one you just saw with LDAP API. Make your core logic easy to test and beware of intrusive frameworks. All the teams I met who using Axon, Vertex, Camel, Webflux are sorry. They are locked into those technologies and they can never leave. And on the other side of the game, we have the AVS song.
There's MQ, EC2, and Redshift and game listing glue. There's Lumberyard, Lightsail, and Workdocs and Workmail and WorkLink and Private Link too. Detective, Inspector, and Trusted Advisor, Cognito, Corretto, S3.
If you start building your stuff around 170 services in Amazon, good luck moving to Azure. So it's a thing that you have to keep in mind. The moment you write your essential business logic, what makes you different from your competition on something specific to Amazon, good luck with negotiations. Yeah. And with that, I think I don't know, let's have you can take me to a certain slide, we can have something on the screen, let's debate on stuff. So, what do you guys think about all this? Is it still relevant? What weaknesses what is your opinion? I don't know. Let's see.
Personally, I would say it's more relevant than ever. Actually, it never wasn't irrelevant. It was all the time relevant. But it seems like in the last years, there was some kind of resurrection of this topic. At least I feel so, that this happened. Not sure why. Maybe because all of us are doing web things and we have dependencies. We all depend on external systems that sometimes lead to crashing our system. And that definitely has to do with dependency inversion. And personally, when I do consulting at customers, nearly always I see problems in dependency inversion, which means they depend on data structures or things that an external provider provides. And then someday, even for years, nothing changed. The day comes and it changes and your application is crashed.
The
Without
breaking change, yeah.
Yes, the breaking change. And this is actually, I'm surprised because you can secure yourself quite easily from this.
But that comes at a cost, Ralph. So I think that's a problem I always have, is that if you start with a simple system, it's also easy to just have your core models just mapped to your database, which you control and save it. And if there is some ugly ass LDAP API in there, just throw in those fields and work with them. So because the cost of those boundaries is, well, it's kind of bad, because if we go back to the onion architecture, then you have at least 4 versions of your class, because it will live in the core, it will live in the persistence interface, it will live in the LDAP interface, and probably in UI interface. You will all have a different object. And I also run out of acronyms then, because I have the user DTO, I have a user JSON, I have a user DB, and then I have a user LDAP. And what if I have 2 DBs? To have then a user DB1 and a user DB2. So I think that is kind of the thing what makes this a hard sell to teams. Because when you start an application, why would you need all that redundancy? Why do you need those boundaries? Because when you start in a greenfield situation, nothing is holding you back. There is nothing already breaking around you. And that is, I think, I found this a really hard sell. If you start with a simple application, all you're going to build are CRUD things. You create, read, update, and delete things. And the business logic is not really there.
That's right.
And that's something I'm struggling with. And I do find things like MapStruct helping there. So if your model is just the same, you can just throw it from one model to the other. But then that raises just question: if it's the same model in the beginning, why would you need 2?
Why? Why would you have a separate structure if it's identical?
Yes.
Correct.
You're completely right.
Yeah. One warning about the MapStruct. Please.
I just wanted to say that what Peter pointed out is 100% true. This stuff comes with a high cost. The cost is mapping things all over the place, having a bunch of classes that seem in first place very identical. So it's very hard to sell that upfront in a greenfield project, sometimes nearly impossible. But at some point, you need to do risk management. I would consider this is risk management. If you apply dependency inversion or even hexagonal or clean architecture, you're doing risk management. And you're not always securing everything. We don't do this in private life either, right? We don't insure everything that can be insured. We reflect, oh, is it worth? Do I take the risk, or is the risk not relevant, or do I take the risk? And this is the same here in systems. If I know my external system, if I already made the experience that it sometimes breaks, for example, then I might consider, oh, it's worth the effort. But if I have a system that is highly reliable, maybe I shouldn't do it. Maybe it's not worth the invest.
Means stable. If it never changed for
Yes, quite
decades.
stable.
Yeah, I think I take that away from clean architecture, that as if you're developing an application, you should think about boundaries. I think that is one of your main things if you're designing any code-based application, is thinking about where those boundaries are. And I found out that I have a habit of making too many boundaries too soon. And then you have those use costs that you need to sell to teams or to people. And that is one of the risks. Somebody said in the chat, Stephen, that sounds like primitive obsession if your duo is the same as the main model. And I think that's the main problem. It starts becoming obsessive. And then you have to say, yeah, but what if it changes? And people say, yeah, we don't know. Hey, Youngie, you ain't gonna need it, so why worry? But the problem with boundaries is that once you forgot them, and once they're not in place, then you're gonna feel the pain if you need them. And then it's too late, because if you're in production and they roll out a version of the new LDAP model and it breaks your production application, will you then say, all right, well, let's take a step back, drink some tea, watch some videos by Victor, think about how will we break down this problem? No, you will just say, all right, wait, okay, so I put this in my domain logic. If LDAP version is version 1.4, then I will call this function, otherwise I will call the other function. So you're still with a mess. So yeah, drawing those boundaries is really important. But I do believe in dependency inversion. I think it's a very powerful mechanism to protect your core from unintended changes.
Totally agree. I mean, I think that why this is still relevant, right? Because this comes from the beginnings, right? I think that in computer science, we are always trying to address complexity, right? I think it's one of the things we are trying to address from the very beginning, right? And one of the two representation of complexity is dependencies, right? One of the causes, right? The other could be maybe obscurity, and maybe for this is something that is important to highlight, right? And dependency injection is going to address this one, right? But at the same time, you are saying that the boundaries, right? And sometimes you don't know where these boundaries are. And maybe this is related because you don't know, right? You are in a complex domain in which, if I'm mentioning the Cinefin model, in which you don't know how, maybe even the customer you are developing the software to, right, doesn't really know at the beginning how the domain is, right? So you are going to discover it together. So maybe at the beginning you don't know which those boundaries are, but this doesn't prevent you to keep using the dependency inversion and keep adapting how the code should look like and adding boundaries once you know more about it and it becomes more complex, right? So I'm a truly believer on the evolving and emerging domains.
As complexity accumulates. So when complexity starts growing, you need to be able to pull the handbrake and say, okay, now let's introduce the dependency inversion because the complexity is too high, or we suspect that it's going to break, they're going to change the version, they're going to betray us. And then when that comes, don't do it too early, but when that comes, your team should be ready to do this change, and they should know how to introduce the adapter. That should be one of the exercises you do with the teams. How can we defend from a structure when we feel we should? Interesting.
I think you
Just to
can
clarify-
already define where the boundaries will be, right? There are some important boundaries that are between your UI and your domain. I think that always warrants a boundary because you can really pretty quickly predict that there will be other representatives of your UI logic, and you might even want to do some aggregation in your UI stuff. You want to put some logic there, perhaps, that is specifically for the way you want to render things. So I think we already found that boundary is really important. I don't know if any of you have ever worked with GSPs of more than 400 lines that has business logic spread in all those GSPs everywhere. And yes, so that's a very classic boundary. And then I think that if you read from another system, like an LDAP, that also warrants a boundary. And then after that, I think, yeah, it's I'm not all for boundaries inside my domain. Perhaps if I have a very big domain, I might see the need to have some at least structure my code in such a way that it's that there are boundaries between bounded contexts, but I wouldn't even put the interface there. I think a class would be enough. And it would, yeah, very hard think on if you want to very strictly say, all right, so this user class is part of this bounded context, so I will create another one for this other bounded contract in my domain core, because then you're kind of wasting things.
So you're going to start slicing the application not by rings or layers, you're going to start slicing it like this. like breaking it in separate problems, in separate domains. Like
I would try to slice my domain into separate domains, but I would not put very hard boundaries there. I would keep those boundaries really soft and flexible and easy to change.
I agree on what you say about the, I think that the separation with the infrastructure and the UI is necessary, kind of always from the very beginning, right? Or it can be helpful, right? And this is what the hexagonal architecture says, right? They don't say anything about how to structure the domain part, but yes, creating boundaries between what is inside and what is outside. So yeah, I kind of agree. Later, I think the discrepancies comes from how we organize the code inside, or how we, let's face it in a different way, how we handle complexity inside of our domain, right? Because, for example, something that in my experience worked is starting with something like transactional script, in which you put everything together. And once you identify that the logic is start being big, so at the end of the day, you are going to have a fat application service, let's call it that way, and an anemic domain, right? Because maybe at the beginning can make sense, everything together, you look where the things are going. But later, if it starts growing, maybe you can start considering to pushing back some of this logic and creating a thin application service layer and a rich domain model, right? Later, it can continue growing, and maybe you can consider also, splitting in use cases, or because maybe your application services start to grow and handle a lot of use cases. And maybe this is a good point in which you can consider to split these application services in use cases, right? So maybe, but at the end of the day, as I said, it depends on how the things grow, right? Because if they don't grow, why do you need a complex domain model?
Wait, you touched on something interesting. You said to cut the application services like in separate use cases. One class here, one class there. This what you mean?
Yeah.
Yes. This, my friend, is called vertical slice architecture. There is a link on that in the event also. It's something from Jimmy Bogard. It doesn't come for free. There are some risks associated, but it's the most recent architecture that was invented. Start with one class there, and then pour off the code inside if things grow big. Yeah, so slice the application service at the periphery. Okay.
I think maybe we need to clarify one thing, because depending on the discussion also in the chat, if you apply things like hexagonal architecture, very dogmatic, I think no one will love it. It's over-engineered. It feels very wrong. So I think no matter what, which of those you choose, you need to be pragmatic. The thing is, what means pragmatic in which cases? We talked about, Angel brought up use cases. What are use cases in comparison to what was said before? CRUD operations. Would you really do all that mapping stuff if you only have CRUD stuff? Really? What is your business logic that you like to protect? Where is your business logic in CRUD? There is no business logic. That's why it's a bad idea. So skip it. And this is where you apply some kind of relaxed way of implementing it. You don't do all that mapping stuff with CRUD operations, only with real business logic. That's the only case where it really matters. And this is also, by the way, the definition of use cases. It's not CRUD. It's something.
I think a lot of applications start with being CRUD.
Yeah.
And
that is correct. Yes.
And then the requirements start coming in, and then it turns out that CRUD is not CRUD, and that you need to reason about your data before you save it, because otherwise, what's the point of having an application if you just want to put stuff into a database?
Just to explain what CRUD is, because the question came up. CRUD means just creating, update, or deleting objects. So, for example, create a new user, delete a user, update a user. This is not really business logic.
No, but if you start at an application from scratch, then that is most of the time what you start. So if
Yes,
you
you
want to
need it.
start a product catalog, you start with create a product, and then you will have there a create update product, and then people say, yeah, but we also want to delete product, and then we have a delete product, and then you have those simple operations. But then somebody says, yeah, but wait, if a product has been sold just once in its lifetime, we can never delete it. And products which are very popular should never be moved from category, because then things might go haywire. So you cannot change the category of an often sold product. And then the business logic comes in. And then it turns out that your simple save this product operation actually means, well, try to see if we can save it. And if we can't save it, we have a fallback scenario, and we need to inform the user in a useful way, because showing is an SQL except that says this field has to be filled is also not acceptable. So, and that happens to a lot of applications, and that's where the problem starts.
So I guess we agree that we need to start simple, transaction script or something simple. Let the complexity accumulate, and when the complexity accumulate, be on the lookout to start investing more in creating these layers, extracting application services, isolating logic from the external world, layers or rings or whatever you want to call them. Interesting, but don't do it religiously. There's Steven in the chat here in Zoom saying, hey, I'm working in a code base full of interfaces and classes ending in impl. Just because we have to have interfaces. This is wrong. Interfaces should serve a purpose, should achieve some delimitation. You want to do, not just mandatory religiously creating them.
I would say that in the modern days, there is hardly any need for an interface in Java, unless you actually have two implementations of the same piece of software, or you need to narrow down something. So you say, all right, I have a user with 40 fields, but in some cases, I just need I want 3 of them visible, so I define an interface for that.
With also the example that I gave at the beginning, user provided implemented by the LDAP adapter.
As part of a contract, if you want somebody else to implement it, yes, then you also need an interface. That's correct. Yeah, you're right.
Separate interface versus implementation, or dependency inversion, or the famous my API client jar. My API client jar, version 2.0. The interface inside the jar, many companies that came from a monolith went this way, shared jar. That's exactly what I was saying.
Actually, you get very, very fast to those two implementations. If you do one thing, if you do testing, then you end up very, very soon having two implementations. If you skip testing, okay, then maybe all of that stuff is not necessary.
I don't need an interface. No, I don't need an interface to test them. No, unless you want to go back to the fake. To the fake repo implements e-repo. Unless you want to do that.
It's actually suggested in the chat, indeed. So if you want that, yes, then you need those interfaces. But I find that with mocking and then using Mockito to generate stubs, you can cover a lot. So there's a lot you can do with simple saying, if this method is called, return this list. And then if you really need more, you can, I think I would rather than spin up a in-memory database, for example, and use the real repo then, instead of implementing my own, I don't know, a hash map in memory where I can basically recreate part of what the database is doing for me to use my testing. So in all my life, I have never actually created a true fake test implementation.
I did multiple times for good reasons, because your argumentation really leads to, okay, I depend very much on my mocking library, and some people don't like that. I remember teams that heavily relied on Power Mockito. I don't know if you are aware of Power Mockito.
It was the one that could change static functions,
Yes.
right?
Yes,
Final
and those guys told me, hey, why are you using Mockito these days? Power Mockito is so much better. You can do everything with it. The point is, you get used to breaking your design. You don't feel the pain in testing. The pain. Victor has a great talk about this. Your tests are talking to you. I think this was the title, right?
Yeah.
And this is so true. And I also remember I'm not a big fan of relying too heavily on magic, and Mockito is to some degree magic. There are even guys that proclaim you don't need mocking frameworks at all. I do use them too, and I like them, but not always. Sometimes it's much more expressive to use a fake, in my opinion.
That could be a good case. In my life, I only use the mocking framework simple. I learned that lesson the hard way. I remember implementing my entire database system with in my mocking framework with answers and all kinds of callbacks that would then just try to be the database, which of course didn't make any sense. But these days I can get away with just using some when then statements to insert the data objects I need in my classes.
Okay, mocking testing, that's a debate. So in my opinion, in what I see, not my opinion, I don't have opinions anymore. In what I see in the industry, Mockito is everywhere. Sometimes even too much for my taste, leading to fragile tests, getting you the path, getting you afterwards wonder why are my unit tests breaking anything I do to the design. That's a problem, and that's one reason for going for the no mock or less mocks movement. Agree. But let's come back on the architect. There are many questions here also in the YouTube stream, but I can't really track all of them. So guys, if you want to help, can also look in there to see what interesting discussion, interesting points to bring on the table here.
Oh, the first question I really like: is Spring intrusive or not?
Yeah. Well, can I take this? Can I take this one, please? Can I take this? Can you do backend development, serious backend development, without a dependency injection framework?
No.
Are you familiar with any serious application logic without dependency injection?
I've been
I have
using
a client in Canada, but yeah.
Yeah, this is Canada,
Not
of course.
fun.
So
No, it's very weird bold code. It's really not the typical. It's hard. Dependency injection is there like a must to allow you to crack your code better, easier. It's there. So, am I afraid of Spring? No, if I'm sticking to the basics of dependency injection.
yes,
But I want
you should.
some nasty Spring kung fu in there with some event listeners, transaction event listeners, and the pre-persist hooks and last modified by annotation. Probably that's too much magic for most systems.
Well, actually, I'm going to say that I try to keep Spring outside of the domain part, because it's fine in the adapters part, where I have to inject all the stuff, but you don't want to see any frameworks in your domain because they pollute your domain. Because you bring other concepts, not just lists and sets, but significantly other concepts into the code of your domain, and that makes this code harder to understand. And therefore, I use dependency injections outside, but I still use usual constructors and configurations for creating the beans. The configurations are outside because they are just bridged to the Spring framework.
Agreed. The configuration for the Spring framework
not in the domain.
Not in the domain. Constructor dependency injection, feel free to use. Value annotation to inject a property, not a problem in my opinion.
I agree more with. I don't mind seeing an at service annotation in my domain, especially if I combine it with Mockito, where I have required args constructor. Then Spring can just create complex objects like it's nothing And if you want to recreate that with it's really like a breeze. You just add those, but indeed, don't go haywire. Don't start using all kind of
created
point
a live
cuts to-
template. Done.
Yeah.
Friends. These all come bundled together. Right.
Yeah, I
But,
would even argue that inside your domain you don't even need logging. But if you keep it simple, the KISS principle, then Spring Framework is great. And if you indeed want to do all the Hooju magic it also provides, I would shy away from that because that goes against the KISS principle. You need to keep it simple.
I mean, event listeners, there are also things we can do.
Scheduled. Indeed, you're
not sure even about transactional. Not entirely sure is the
No.
responsibility of the. So yes, in the
I
sense-
think with
yeah.
transactional is also fine because it's one of those places where our perfect Java object-oriented world has to accept that, yeah, but in the real world we need transactions because we need to be sure. So we can close our eyes and pretend that they're not there, but you need to think about transactions when you design your application, and it's a business decision where transactions live. So yeah, I guess we're stuck with it. We cannot pretend that we can pretend a lot of things and ignore the real world in our models, but not with transactions because you need that security. You need those asset properties for your domain and for your your
Anything else,
application can be as beautiful as this, but if it's nothing gets saved, then it's pretty useless.
Yeah.
For most things, if nothing goes out, then your application is useless.
You have to change something in a consistent way.
Yeah, and something has to come out of your application, otherwise you're a black hole. Which is interesting physiological, but not really an
There is
application.
a question about managing transactions. Where should the transactions be started in such an architecture? So let's bring the discussion more on the diagrams back. Where should the transaction be started? Should we start it there? Should we start it in there? Should we start it in there?
It's a very good question. It should start in the application layer, I guess. I think that should be a place where you say, all right, this is a logical piece of work that needs to be saved in an asset way. So this should be atomically saved. It's either gets saved everything or nothing gets saved. That mostly is business logic. So if you create an object, you want to create a safe object. But if you want to save your shopping cart or your order, you want to make sure everything connected to the order is saved or not.
I think that using a database is not a business requirement, it's implementation detail. But having transaction is a business requirement. And therefore, use of transactional annotation, I welcome it in my domain because it helps me to express business requirement.
It is a business requirement to use a transactional database, an SQL database. That is a requirement. And you control the transactions, even it from the domain. Interesting. Okay, I think that
not the database, no matter how it's implemented. But if it's something that expresses business concern, because it would be bad for the business if transaction boundaries are broken, if there is inconsistency in the data, not the database specifics, but this requirement. And therefore, this requirement should be also mirrored in the domain code, in the core.
Correct. Agree. When you have
I have a question, Dimitri.
Please.
We were talking about having Spring in the domain. Okay, but what about standard libraries? Do you standard annotations? Do you have concerns using them in the domain model or in the domain, not domain model?
Give me an example, actually.
Okay. So instead of using @AutoWire, for example, you use @Inject. Now we are on the lane of standardization.
Well,
This comes from the
believe
JD
it's
standard.
open question. You need some atoms in the language you use. And if you agree that Inject is a standard and you want to depend on it, then you can use it. But if you agree, it's like kind of extension, kind of a mechanism, but you don't want to see it, rather not. So personally, I don't use injects well in many parts where it might be used. Also, the same reason because of Spring, because actually it's implementation detail and also makes a test a little bit more transparent. But once you are used to certain way to express yourself and say, yeah, I don't want to you have constructor, I have like or Lombok, or I have injects, I don't want to call the constructor, then it just becomes the air with you breathe. You don't see it. You just use it. You just breathe it. And if you're at that level and everyone is used to it, then you just don't see it. It's not a distraction any longer. So it depends.
Thanks.
I'm a bit concerned now because the discussion goes very deep into Java specifics and Spring specifics. And I want to keep the discussion, if possible, a bit more on the principles and on the driving lines, the boundaries. And there is a question interesting about how can we handle cross-cutting concerns in a clean architecture. Let's try to tackle that. Yeah.
Aren't cross-cutting concerns mostly non-functional requirements? I thought about this just the other day. I was like, what kind of cross-cutting concerns? There is security, but that's a gray area between business requirements and the authentication is kind of a gray area between non-functional and functional requirement. I think most cross-cutting concerns are actually non-functional requirements which should not be specifically modeled in a domain unless there's a very clear functional requirement. For example, if you have a very high secured system, then security might be extremely important, but then it becomes part of your domain. Then, for example, I struggle with this. I struggle with the need to have cross-cutting concerns inside my domain logic. Like metrics, yeah, but why would I care about metrics inside my domain logic? I want to care. That's specifically something you want to measure at the boundaries. You want to, because that's where you feel the pain.
The question doesn't refer to the domain itself. It refers to where should we handle this in a clean architecture. And can we agree that we want to handle them as peripheral as possible?
In my opinion, yeah. Domain agnostic are concepts that are domain agnostic. Doesn't matter.
It depends, because I think all the metrics like annotations or like AOP is basically extending of your basic language that we're used to express your domain. And you should be very careful about language extensions, because every kind of that annotation or aspect is a language extension, because you introduce some word which has very broad meaning, which has influence, which has a lot of impact on the behavior. So if you think that in your specific case, you need this language extension, I would not say no. But if it's just arbitrary language extension, it's easier to keep it away from the domain, to keep it clear. Because once you start using so many words that you don't remember them any longer, it becomes complicated. It's no longer.
You overcomplicate the logic. You put too much complexity in the same place. So try to rip them off as possible. Peter was suggesting that security sometimes is a core domain business. Also transactions, I think we agreed it can sometimes be very critical to how the application is written. In terms of performance also this. So yeah, we will start from periphery, and unless required, we will keep it at the boundary. Huh? Okay.
Yeah, I think if we go back to the model, to the slide, there's this nice white line across the application and between the presentation. I think that is a little bit higher. I think I would take the other one. I would take that line and I would put there my cross-cutting concerns. And also there was a good suggestion by on the YouTube chat, I think by JetTat. He said, well, if you have security concerns, then I think that is the place where your presentation layer will change those OAuth user thingy roles things and put it in something that your application understands as, all right, so this is the user, this is his role, and I would, place that there probably.
So here also leaking into the front end, because the front end has to adapt, has to adjust to the permissions. You don't want to show a button if you can click it.
Yeah, but the front end is also, they are the ones who have to follow the application, right? They are the suckers who just have to do whatever the application wants them to do. So if that tells them you need to translate all those 45 LDAP.
Who wants to make a lot of fun about the things I care so much about, full stack, about having a culture in which you build both. You don't just hate the front end guys. No, you build the front end. Thank you. So I really believe that full stack is the truth, the answer.
No, I believe that too. But in this sense, presentation has to follow the application. That is the idea of dependency inversion. The application will specify to the presentation layer how it's going to be. So I think that is not leakage. That is just the way things are designed, right?
You could say that. I believe, yes.
And then somebody needed to do the translation of this huge LDAP OAuth user object into something that applications. But I only need the role, the user ID, and the organization ID, for example, because those are imported inside my domain.
Okay.
And then indeed, if I offended any front-end people, no, I also do front-end. So, well, very little, but they are valuable. But in this sense, the same goes for persistent infrastructure. If the application decides that it wants 4 extra fields, you just have to cough them up because you have to supply the implementation of that service. And of course, it's all the same team, but yeah.
Let's twist it this way. Remember the days in which we had a front-end team, separate completely? We had a meeting with them. They were not based in the same country. And the DBA team that was the only one that was allowed to touch and another team to talk for the ASB team that welcome to a bank. So these are called silos, right? We have the Java team, we have the ESB team, we have the front-end team. And Peter is suggesting here, this is not very productive, is it?
No, that's not.
We want to break these silos up. Hey, look, this is like nuclear. We want to break these silos up. We want as much as full stack as you can. Yes.
And with the rise of Agile, we now have more or less cross-functional teams. So we don't need to protect ourselves from our colleagues, which are in the same team. That's not necessary anymore.
Mm-hmm.
Well, you protect yourself not from the colleagues in your team. You protect themselves from the things beyond the persistence, beyond the infrastructure. And you want a flexibility in your presentation layer because that is where your domain logic can easily be reused for other users, other goals, the things you didn't think of when you started. And so we go, hey, but I need the same thing actually, but I need it in a very different UI. And that's where your presentation layer becomes is a separate thing. And also in these days, perhaps presentation easily becomes API.
Max in Zoom. Conway is low. If you want this to be your funnel architecture, make sure you create separate teams. And then you do your architecture 5 years later. I love it. Folks, don't do that.
Yeah, but I also think that the presentation layer being dependency inversed, if I can say it that way, is not to protect your application. It's there to protect the consumers of your application. Because if you want to change your API, you probably still need to backward compatible. And then is the presentation layer, which these days is most of the time a REST API layer. That's the layer where you will say, all right, my application now requires 4 more fields, but 4 of my consumers, 4 of my other applications have not yet implemented that. So here are the useful defaults, which I can use to. So the presentation layer is not as much it allows the flexibility to represent your data and functionality in different ways, in different, there can be multiple disguises for your functionality. That's the main benefit of separating your presentation from your application layer. So there you protect not.
I agree that I like your perspective, And it also enables you to build very customized APIs towards your application for very specific customers, if that is required. Although there are technologies to prevent you from doing this. Not prevent, but you don't need to do it. For example, GraphQL or something like that.
You write now Kafka, Rabbit, and API. But what if you have API version 1, which has been used by 20 clients, and then you have API version 2, which introduces some new concepts that you find out in your domain are actually necessary. So then you have API version 1 and API version 2. That's the way I work these days, because I have now 20 customers for my API. So only I can do is expand my contract or make a whole new version out of it and tell my new customers, but now you should move to this endpoint. But that's where I need the presentation layer, because the presentation layer in my application is full of, if this field is null, use this default, or if the new field is not filled, look at the deprecated field and use then the deprecated field instead of a new field, because you need that flexibility in your presentation layer.
Well, this argument leads to a question when you need to introduce it. Should you introduce it before you got your version 2? Should you introduce your presentation layer before, or is it Yagni?
Yes. Yeah, I think you always need that. You always need the presentation, because the presentation layer is the thing that will change the most.
I believe, Dimitri, correct me here, you're asking about whether is it okay to leak out the domain structures to my client?
Well, actually, I think that as long as I have my domain and it's okay to be used as object, as data structure to be sent out, I don't see a reason to duplicate it. But once I get this reason, I can make this separation because of a reason.
But what is the cost of doing this?
More mapping. You leak out your entity.
The cost mapping at the beginning, or mapping when you know why you need it.
This is one of the classical questions. Should I expose my domain model? The general answer is never. For three reasons. The moment you expose your structures, they freeze. As the others depend on them, can't change them anymore without breaking someone. You might leak out unwanted details, and you will pollute your domain model with stuff that has to do with exposing the API, JSON format, JSON ignore, and all the garbage. So no, never, ever, ever do this.
Well, and if it's internal API?
To who? Yeah,
I'm the consumer, so it's kind of inside.
Then you are over engineering, because if you are the consumer, then why would you go through HTTP and JSON?
Whoa, interesting discussion.
Or you are an external system in the same company, and then I think a simple REST API is not a over-engineered thing. So I put it on the chat. Your presentation layer is the part where you show your where you expose your data to an external party, either a user or a system, and whether that is whether you own both applications, then you can think about, well, if those two models are just the same, I might have over-engineered my design, and I should just merge those two applications into one modulet or monolith, or in one application. Then I just
there are reasons to split out some part of a code to another deployment.
Yes, but then I think you should pay the price of putting REST API there, unless you have another reason. For example, REST is too slow when you need, I don't know, direct sockets, or you want to do some fancy object database, share multi-fast cache. But even there, you need, as soon as you say I have system A and system B and they're separate, then you have a contract, whether it's REST or whether it's a AAB interface, if people still remember those. As soon as you have
have you seen internal APIs? Have you met such a concept in production? Do you have internal APIs that that you control who's allowed to call very strictly, and there's only one single module that you also control or something. Have you met such a thing?
I never.
You never, huh?
There's
Okay.
fireworks behind you, Victor. Doing great.
I met several times, but I,
mean-
think that there were like exceptions. Yes. Few.
Just from the chat, something that maybe resonates with some of us, the discussion about presentation, but also infrastructure. You could say this is an anti-corruption layer. And that is true. Sometimes you're protecting the consumer, sometimes yourself, maybe both. And personally, to me, the main question to ask is, do I have, as you pointed out, Victor, do I have control about that other system, yes or no? And if the answer is no, I don't have control, then it might be a good idea to decouple myself, to protect myself from this system. And that's, for me, the most important question. And it's, again, like last time, it's the question about boundaries.
This is where context mapping, flow of change come into play, right?
Exactly. Yes.
Team topologies, this is where they come into play, right? Once you have a huge domain and you have not only different teams, but different areas in a company working for different stuff. Yep. So, totally.
And even internal APIs are, it's not a big difference. Do you have control about over the team that provides, that changes the internal API? Yes or no, if you're the consumer. And if it's a no, then decouple yourself. I had this situation multiple
I got
times.
2 services, and the same team was developing the both, but they were just split to have like single responsibility, not to have one service do too much stuff. But there was no need of having a separation, or because it was still very close to the same domain. So, and therefore, actually, therefore, your description like it very much, because I would not say it was beyond the boundary. And therefore, this anti-corruption DEL stuff would be not needed at this. But whenever you think it's a boundary, then you need to be consistent to the outside and be safe to the inside.
Yes.
Interesting. I wonder how well this scales in practice. How well can you defend this internal API?
I work at a big bank, and we have API, and we have a big API gateway in between, and it really helps keeping track of who is actually consuming your APIs, who's making which calls, because before we had that, we had no idea. We just exposed an endpoint, and we had no idea who was calling us. So
at the end, also depends who can change it, right? If it's the people of the same squad that can change both, yeah, it's fine. It's like when you're inside of your code. But yeah, maybe you
we actually have that. We have one API that we have one separate application that came to be because it's very different, and we changed it then a little bit more to actually call our main application. And just a few days ago, we had a change which broke the system because we had not enough boundaries, and we had to plan that with to say, all right, it was okay because we could plan it. We could say, all right, it's only used during office hours, so we just plan the release at 8 o'clock. So we first release the main application, we shut down the other ones. We just tell everybody, hey, we're shutting down the application, and we roll out the new one, and we were all happy. And the next morning, I got a message, hey, Peter, next time we cannot do that because we have 4 or 5 customer files that failed because I didn't realize there was a batch job running, and there were still people using the system. So yeah, it shows you the importance of those boundaries and being flexible enough to, in the end, you will always regret not putting a flexible interface there in your presentation layer, or a separation between your inner data and your outer data. And you can just start by exposing your domain model outside, but at least make it in such a way that when you stop doing that, you have at least some boundaries there that make it possible to say, all right, but now it doesn't work anymore. So I just copy my domain model, throw in some mappers, and then start changing it.
Right. Now, folks, it's been an hour already. Unfortunately, I think we can go like this for half a day at least. But there are many questions in the chat that I could not keep up with. I would suggest the following. I'm going to draw a line in the chat. I see that you've started answering yourselves, which I love to hear. Like 100 people in YouTube and 80 people in Zoom. I'm going to read the stuff that I noted down while you were speaking. As a kind of a conclusion, if you want to bring more ideas. And if you want your question to be answered, retype or reformulate your question after the line I've put in the chat, so that we can start tackling them. It shouldn't be more than 15 minutes, after which I want to end up. I mean, I was criticized to take too long to. So let's see. While you put the question, so at start it seems redundant to create this isolation with adapters. Start small, address the risks you see. When things get complicated, only then you look around and you ask, hey, do I want to defend myself? There are some classic boundaries like UI that you want to respect with good reasons to maintain compatibility, to decouple, to declutter the core. There are boundaries inside the domain which might actually be more effective to break the problem into subproblems, that is bounded context and modulith. We start small with the transaction script and then we introduce the application layer. We've also mentioned vertical slice architecture, Jimmy Bogard. Search for his video. Bogard, yes. Applying architecture dogmatically, religiously will lead to a lot of ways to be pragmatic. Okay. Interfaces should be used for implementations if you have more, or to separate somehow formally the interface from its implementation, whether you do want to do dependency inversion or to ship the interface separately to your clients. Can you do serious backend without dependency injection framework? No. Don't be afraid of Spring, but don't use its magic, too much magic also, in the core of your complexity. Keep that peripheral, as well as with cross-cutting concern. Like this, try to keep them peripheral. Internal API, quite interesting debate. If you have the political power to make that happen, it can allow you to trust the API, and it might allow you less complexity. So we have one first question from, so again, my invitation is to repeat your question or copy paste your question into the chat. I have one from YouTube, which says, what if you have multiple applications that share some domain entities? Ooh. Would you create a shared domain library and import it in the domains, or consider an external dependency and map them? Do you want to take this?
Let them evolve. Let them evolve independently. This is my advice. I mean, it depends, of course, but when you share your couplet, so you have to understand what's the cost you are paying for doing so, right? It's like the microservices hype, right? Why microservices or what are they coming into play? To allow different teams to work independently, right? So for doing so, the most effective way of doing so is to repeat code. So I can translate this to this, right? If you are sharing models, maybe you have to let the models evolve independently, even though they share apart. So again, it depends. But if you want to foster independent, the teams to be working independently, let them evolve independently. This is where DDD comes from, right? You have the user, but you have the point of view user from the shopping cart subdomain. That is not the same that for the invoices subdomain. So at the end of the day, what you do, let the models evolve independently. So these are my 2 cents.
I agree. Actually, if you would do this, this is a destructive way of ignoring everything DDD, what we learned from DDD. One domain at some day wants to change the model. How can this be done?
It involves a lot of meetings, a lot of friction. The domain will freeze.
The solution that, of course, is create a domain authority of a special team that will only deal with domain things. And so, if you want to have a change, you have to first,
create a workforce.
Go to a process to have it changed, and then it will send an email out to all the teams everywhere that on this day this domain will change. And then if you miss that email and your production breaks, then at least they can point to you and say, Yeah, but we sent an email years ago, and if you didn't get into that cellar without the stairs where the light is not working, then it's your problem.
If you ask this, you might have a situation in which there are many repeated things, many, dozens of fields. I've seen projects like this. I've seen projects in which you have to repeat something, but don't consider that to be part of your domain. Consider that to be part of some structure, just some structure that happened to move along. It's not my core domain that I'm sharing.
Yes, you shouldn't depend on it, but you should. For big companies, it certainly makes sense to have something like a company-wide definition of certain core domain objects, but that should be on paper. That should be a paper model where if I get a field named like this, they mean this, at least if they follow the instructions. It makes sense to have something like a canonical data model for big companies, but it should not be something that it should be something you protect against. You should make your own copies of those models and be flexible when they change or when you want to change something.
I mean, totally agree.
I think that the question is, should I have a common object between all those things in a jar file? I would say no. That is a road to disaster. But having some kind of agreement on what common objects in your communication APIs look like, that could be a very sound thing to have.
I've been part of such a project. This is after a failure of such a project, I started doing workshops out of depression. I had a very big down. We had an XSD with 120 fields in a single type, and the special field at the end of that type called extensions, which is basically any. It was basically a map of anything to anything. It was a degenerate model that we gave up on maintaining. No one could understand what went on.
But it's so flexible.
It's so flexible. It has extension points. Yeah. Bullshit. Don't do that. Not on a large scale. Okay, fight that. Usage of Spring Transactional in application layer. Is this even okay if it's not really by the book? Is this okay? Yes. When we talk about transactions, consistency or performance, consistency and performance, when they come in, you step out. Design steps out. You can't mess with those. If you have a consistency concern to maintain a transactionality or performance problems, screw clean code. You can't say that. I mean, they come first, right? Not okay. Who cares? It's a consistency constraint, period. So, in my opinion, the place where you want to do your simple architecture is in the space left after you put constraints of performance and consistency in place. So we have consistency, availability, partitioning, and then small clean code for what's left. Anyway, I'm going too far. Not repeat code. No, don't repeat code. Yes, of course. Try.
After saying this, clean code is dead now, Victor. That's your fault.
No. There's still a lot of space. No, don't say that. No. Clean code fills the space in our hearts after performance and consistency take their toll.
Yes, and most of the time, at least in my experience, people argument, oh, we need to do it this way because this is achieves a higher performance. Yes, but most of the time it's not necessary in that part. So you're just claiming it requires performance, but it's wrong. You didn't measure it. You don't have an error or a problem. So don't optimize things that aren't a problem. And in all those cases, prefer clean code.
Performance is never in your Java code. It's in your external calls. So if you want to increase in performance, look at the granularity of your API calls. Look if you can put caches on your database or on some of the external services you read that actually never change. That is where you gain performance, not inside your Java code.
Most of the time, unless there is someone from one of my last clients who has a Java API with a response time of 50 microseconds. Micro, not milli. Micro. If that's your game, then you are invaded by performance everywhere. You will say no to streams because they're expensive.
If you are a Flash trader, yes, you need that. Those who are not Flash traders, You don't need that.
Thank you. Exactly this. Exactly this. Good. All right. What more
And there are
questions we have?
still some interesting questions in the YouTube, I see, but they are a bit. You need to dig them out
What if you,
because they're
please
part of
repeat them.
the
It might have
discussion.
left. Yeah.
When constructing an SDK to help clients calls from REST APIs, should the external DTOs be shared? Should they be separated?
Can you paste it in somewhere, or where should I paste it? Paste it again on YouTube. Like we'll take it from there.
See,
What
I
if you
cannot
just
copy this stuff from. Can I copy?
have very
No,
good
I
API?
cannot. Oh yeah, I can copy. I will put it here.
Oh, interesting. Interesting. This is interesting discussion. Go read about Spring Cloud contract test and PAC-TO. You could have contract tests in between, but some people say that if you went this far, it means you created too many microservices. If you need that kind of technology. When constructing an SDK, to help clients do some REST API, should the external DTO be shared? The client jar. My service.
Yes.
That's a very common. I'm allowed to hear you first, guys. What do you think about this?
I think it could be a good service to your clients, but then it becomes your promise to them, and if they're smart, they will take your promise for a grain of salt and will make sure that they use it to quickly call your service. But then when they get data out of it, they will at least put a boundary there.
Yes, of course.
So you kind of tell them to, hey, it's very easy to call me. You can just use this, and you can put in some. You have a property file where you put username and password, and then it will just call my service, and you will get all the information you need. But if they then use your DTOs into their core domain, hey, that's on them. I think that's also a big win of dependency inversion. Even if the UI or the persistence or the infrastructure decides to take your domain object and save it directly to the database, that's fine.
But
the core will not feel the pain if they decided to remove 4 fields. That's then so the pain of the change is still being pushed outside. So as a core logic part, you should actually don't have an opinion on what people do with your objects you give them. If they want to directly send it to the UI, fine. It won't touch your logic. Unless people then start demanding, hey, I need this extra field here, then you should push back and say, no. If you need 4 extra fields, you make them yourself. You put in that aggregation logic yourself in there. We're not going to do that for you.
So, can we agree that it's actually a good practice to expose the client jar to others if you can afford it? If we are all Java or all .NET or all Python, create such a library to share among the teams? I've seen this very often.
We abandoned the practice and we just said, look, you can just you do it yourself. We actually have a model jar, and I think some of our teams actually take that jar and use it.
But
and
you
then
can
if there's
generate
space,
it also,
Let's
right?
put it this way: in a world where we have open API and we can generate that stuff, I think it's kind of outdated.
Exactly.
Well,
you can generate
would
it.
you prefer to introduce the generation in the code, or you prefer to import a jar, which is faster to build?
It's faster
real
to build,
time.
yes. But anyway, if I get the jar or if I generate, if I let these objects introduce my domain, if I'm the client, then I'm doing things wrong. Anyway, I need to decouple anyway.
Exactly.
We actually I have seen production issues with this because people were using our models because we have a very modular project, and they could say, okay, just give me your API models and we'll use it. And they were deserializing directly to it. Then we added a field, and we also had a change of our repositories inside because we always need another repository because company requires us to move to a more secure location. And then actually their pipeline was not allowed to go to that location. And it wasn't a problem because they downloaded an old version on the old system and it never changes. And then we pushed the change and their system broke in production again. So it's I think those I agree with Ralph. You can better generate it or wrap it in your own model, because somebody somewhere somebody will change something and it will break. And it's a great service to your client, but yeah, it's even better if you just hand them indeed an open API file and have them generate the stuff.
Right. So whether you use OpenAPI and you generate classes on the client, or you share a jar, they should still defend against your structures, protect their complexity inside.
And if they want the jar, then they could create a module that is just generating the stuff and create their own library. If that's
More
really
modules.
the reason.
More
Yeah,
modules for
more
this
modules.
pipeline to build.
Well, you can make a multi-pump project, so that also works
Yes,
very well.
and you add more build time.
Yeah, but build time, don't optimize those things before they become a problem.
It's 10 seconds more, 3 seconds more, 5 seconds.
Then give Azure more money and buy a fancier machine. I mean, don't optimize things that are not really, yeah.
Should you structure your microservice with the 4 layers presentation, application, infrastructure, domain from the start, even if it's just a CRUD service? I think that's I would propose to finish with this question. Should you start with microservice with this onion? So, onion makes you cry. Should you start your microservice with a cleanly decoupled? Yes, what do you think?
I would start with 3 layers, not 4.
Hexagonal.
So I would, if you use an entity in the use case, I would then at least, if we go back to the question, I would skip the domain layer. I think I would put the application domain layer together.
Mm-hmm.
And even consider putting my database inside that layer. And the other things I would indeed, this would be preferred go-to starting architecture.
Just one thought about this. I agree. But if you start with this, I doubt that your microservice is really micro. At least I would try to secure that you're not building multiple business things into one service. If that is the case and you really want to do it, then I think it's worth applying those structures. But maybe not from the very start.
Yeah. Interesting. Do you really need 3 layers, 4 layers? I mean, that may be too large. And that's why today, I could show you a much more heavy picture like this, but that's too much.
We need all of this, Victor. We need all of this, and then we can sell consultancy, and we can ask people to tell, no, you did this all wrong because you didn't implement the listener correctly to the.
Some say if you went this far, if you went 4 layers, not 3, you already turn into a monolith. What you should do instead is to start breaking the problems into microservices, which have 3 layers, hexagonal, maybe even VSA, vertical slice, to have smaller grained modules or microservices, not necessarily the networking involved. You can have more modulate very fun. So somewhere in there, when you start putting application service on top of domain service, think again. Don't I want to break the domain actually?
Where is this nice picture that says we have so many architects and every architect needed his own layer, so we stopped giving them logical names. We just put the name of the architect there. It's somewhere on the internet. It's very.
To keep it simple, you want to stay 3 layers should be enough. If you start needing application service versus domain service, maybe think first of cracking it into modules. That's interesting. Excellent. Well, folks, I believe that we could wrap it up. And if you want to put some final thoughts, if you want to share some ideas, some like the key takeaway in your opinion about all of this, please what is most important?
Maybe I can start. For me, I think the last point you mentioned, right? Know the guidelines, know the concepts, not only about the architecture, but complexity, hiding design, modularity, coupling, cohesion, understandability, understand the concepts, and later, also understand your context, right? What is the people that is doing this? What is the knowledge? How they feel comfortable with at the time of programming, and don't force people, right? Sometimes the best architecture emerges for self-organized teams. So I think that is something important, but also it depends on their experience, their skills on refactor, for example, because we are talking to start simple and later making, adding abstractions and modules. But maybe the teams need to know about the basic of struct method, struct class, right? The basics of refactoring or refactoring to patterns. So I think that part's important. But I think that is the most important maybe is not forcing people to do things they don't understand, right? So if they don't understand something, try to guide them and try to, be sure that the decisions they made are informed and they understand them. Otherwise, they are going to, follow it like a dogma and create a mess, no matter the architectural style.
I love it. I love it how you put it. I love it how you put it. Push them to think, help them, train them, but let them decide. I like it. I love it. Ralph, some closing thoughts, some takeaway, something.
The closing sentences, the words of wisdom. There's not a single architecture that covers all your needs, that fits to everything. So you need to adapt, you need to negotiate. And this is actually the hard part in doing architecture properly. It's not applying something by the book. It's about the negotiation. And one part, as Angel also pointed out, is to take into consideration what are the skills of the team, what is my technical context and all that stuff. So there are many, many ingredients that actually lead to a decision, and you should reflect on them as good as you can. And if something goes wrong, maybe you took the wrong path, stay flexible. Don't protect your first decision with everything you have. Be flexible in your head, in your perspectives.
That's a tricky one, Ralph, but it's a very true one.
Yes, I know.
Yeah, I totally agree. Be aware that you're gonna get it wrong at the beginning. Be flexible. Yeah, I like it. Peter, what do you think?
There are some very wise words said already. I would say be careful for that one boundary too many. That's be careful for that one boundary too many. So you need to find just the right amount of boundaries.
Uh-huh.
You need to. So yeah, I think that's the hardest part, and I have no real true good answer for that. You should have boundaries, but how many? I think that's the biggest question. But perhaps if we apply what Ralph just said, be flexible. You will always have just the right amount of boundaries.
I like it. I like it. I like it. Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot for this. I won't provide any takeaway because basically you pointed out better. This I like. Nothing else than this. I'm gonna add it to the discussion here. Good. Now I want to thank you, all of you, for the idea. I want to thank you for answering between one and each other. There was a lot of chat going on in both places, and I thank you guys for your time. And yeah, what should be the next discussion? Let's debate that afterwards. But I see we can just sit here and just listen to the question. Let's talk. That could be cool. Anyway, thank you for your time. I know how hard it was to take it off your schedule. Wish you a great evening. And see you next month. Will be something about social skills and coding with empathy. I'm gonna have a little discussion with someone. And yeah, like a podcast, you'll see. But you're free to join to ask and provide your own insights. I'd love to use you to that. Good. Thank you. Have a great evening, everyone.
You too. Thank you for having us.
Bye. Likewise.
you. Bye.
Bye, everybody.
Evening.
Bye-bye.